Hi there! Once you've completed step one in phase one of building and sustaining a data-informed culture, you're ready to start prioritizing your standards. So let's get real. Student-centered education and standards-based education, they really go hand in hand. A set of learning goals for a certain grade level or content area have been identified. These goals, or standards of learning, fit on a vertical continuum of increased rigor and content area knowledge that provide a pathway for students moving through our schools. From kindergartners to seniors, these are the skills, content, and competencies needed for students to be college and career ready upon graduation. However, the reality is that our standards documents are quite robust, and when compared to the actual time available for instruction and for differentiating that instruction to meet the needs of all learners in our classrooms, well, the task seems overwhelming. The answer to this question, how can teachers effectively teach and assess all their students? It's an easy one. They can't. It's the word effectively that makes this task not only daunting, but also quite impossible. In order to have student-centered instruction and a standards-based educational system, educators have to make choices about how they prioritize their time with students. Larry Ainsworth, author of several books, including Prioritizing the Common Core, identifying specific standards to emphasize the most, has done extensive work with standards, but his goal in working with standards has always been to help educators learn to prioritize. Ainsworth asserts that in the absence of an agreed upon set of criteria for prioritizing the standards, educators will, out of necessity, make up their own. Here in Santa Cruz Valley Unified School District, we've done a great amount of work mapping out our standards into units on curriculum calendars and identifying standards as benchmark or essential and supporting or transitional or even year-long. From a bird's eye view of the district, we know that prioritizing must be happening in our schools and classrooms because it truly is impossible to address all standards with equal amounts of emphasis and time. Our curriculum calendars are meant to be living documents and revisited at least yearly, but with the exception of rare cases, we really have not done the work of prioritizing these standards and collectively agreeing as grade level or content area teams across the district on the identifying of a first priority set of standards. In the state of Arizona, we have sets of adopted standards that have gone through a fairly rigorous review process. Adapted from the Common Core state standards, the Arizona state standards for math and ELA are still not lean enough to effectively be taught and mastered by all students at the end of a grade level or course. As this diagram shows, the standards documents cover the breadth and depth of knowledge a student is expected to master over the course of a year. Without prioritizing standards, teachers tend to focus on the breadth, which, as the saying goes, is an inch deep and a mile wide. At the end of a school year, teachers may be able to honestly say that they taught every standard, but still many of our students are not able to prove on state assessments that they have mastered the learning of every standard. Of course, this lack of mastery creates gaps in learning that are compounded year after year. In our work with Karen Bailey, we're learning that there is a great power and bang for the educational buck when we make the decision to focus. Identifying standards we deem as first priority and second priority will help us do just that, keeping in mind that our goal is to help our students achieve mastery of grade level or content area standards. Focusing on going deeper with learning will help to close instructional gaps. The power of focus does not come easily. Challenging work is ahead because the stakes are high. One of the most important caveats about prioritizing standards is knowing that we do this work without eliminating standards that aren't identified as first priority. These second priority standards typically support first priority standards. They are the natural building blocks to scaffold the instruction, and by focusing on going deeper with first priority standards, the remaining standards will tend to also dive deeper, but in a supportive role. As a biology teacher or any fan of Nemo might say, similar to the clownfish and sea anemone, these two categories of standards have a mutual symbiotic relationship. So how do we do this work of prioritizing? Using resources from Ainsworth, we've identified first priority standards as a carefully selected subset of the total list of the grade or course-specific standards within each content area that students must know and be able to do by the end of the school year. First priority standards represent the assured student competencies that each teacher needs to help each student learn and demonstrate proficiency by the end of the current grade or course. Now, the last sentence of this definition is an important one. If these standards represent assured student competencies that each teacher needs for guiding instruction, the assumption is that a grade level or content area team has come to consensus and agreed on what to prioritize. Once these first priority standards have been identified with great care through a selection process, we are assuring that all students in our district in the same grade level or content area will receive instruction on these standards with the same intensity and with the same intention of achieving mastery. It's also important to note that scholars do recommend that only 30 to 50% of the standards are identified as first priority standards. As mentioned previously, second priority standards are those that support, connect to, or enhance the first priority standards. They are taught within the context of the first priority standards, but do not receive the same degree of instruction and assessment emphasis as do the first priority standards. Remember, although we do prioritize our standards, we do not eliminate the remaining standards. Those second priority standards are still taught and assessed, but we focused on how they support, connect to, or enhance the first priority standards. Let's revisit this quote by Ainsworth. Our goal is to use an agreed upon set of criteria to prioritize standards in our district. We will be using the REAL criteria. Now, this might be new for some or simply review for others, but since we are all in this work together, it's important to be reminded of how this process works. A key component to prioritizing standards is to allow time for effective collaboration and in-depth discussion. We will begin this process in our grade level or content area teams. Later this year, we will analyze our priority standards by looking at them through a vertical lens, kindergarten to 12th grade. And finally, we will put our prioritized standards to work in our classrooms and reflect on the accuracy of our prioritization process using assessment data. The REAL criteria and the content of this presentation is based on work by Larry Ainsworth and Douglas Reeves. An article and blog post have been added to the Google Classroom that will serve as excellent resources for working with the REAL criteria. In short, we prioritize our standards based on readiness, endurance, assessment, which means external exams, and leverage. Let's take a look at each one of these criteria. A standard marked R for readiness means that this standard prepares students for the next level of learning. These are the prerequisites, basically what is needed for students to level up their learning. I've included our high school math pathways document to illustrate this idea of readiness. A student is not able to jump from Algebra 2 to AP Calculus because he or she doesn't have the knowledge of concepts or skills learned in pre-calculus that would allow him or her to be successful in the honors course. To determine if a standard is distinguished as a readiness standard, ask this question. Will proficiency of this standard provide students with the essential knowledge and skills that are necessary for future success within the educational system? A standard marked E for endurance means that it has value beyond a single test or unit. For example, proficiency in reading informational texts and being able to write effectively for a variety of purposes will endure throughout a student's academic and work life. Now, to determine if a standard is distinguished as an endurance standard, ask yourself this question. Will proficiency of this standard provide students with the knowledge and skills that will be of value beyond the present? A standard marked A for assessment means that this standard will be assessed on an external exam, not just on a classroom formative or summative assessment. I'd like to provide a little caution here. Remember, if everything is important, nothing is. As you prioritize, you will most likely mark each of your standards with an A, especially if you are in grades 3 through 12. Yet, yes, in these grade levels, the standards are typically always assessed on external exams, but this criteria alone will not make a standard a first priority standard. Assessments such as AZ Merit will remain a continuing focus in American education for the foreseeable future. However, we have to keep in mind that learning that endures is an instructional goal we shouldn't lose sight of. As Ainsworth says, if we identify and concentrate on the standards that reflect the criteria of endurance, leverage, and readiness, isn't it likely that we will be effectively preparing students to do well on standardized tests? Finally, a standard marked L for leverage means that this standard has value in multiple disciplines. For example, proficiency in creating and interpreting graphs, diagrams, and charts, and then being able to make accurate inferences from them will help students in math, science, social studies, language arts, and many other areas. To determine if a standard is distinguished as a leverage standard, ask yourself if it has application within your content area or if it has interdisciplinary connections. Now that we have some background on the criteria we'll be using, let's talk through the prioritizing process. Step 1. Individually read each standard and identify the criteria that applies, R, E, A, or L. Some standards will only fit one of the criteria, and others might fit all four. Try to do this quickly so you don't spend too much time on any one standard. Working individually during this first step is very important to the process. This allows each professional to have the think time needed to make a decision. However, the first round is meant to be rapid. You will soon be discussing and collaborating with teammates to make a final determination. Step 2. With your partner or team, compare your criteria selections for each standard. Discuss any differences, consult resources for clues, and adjust criteria as needed. Spend some time here, but try not to dwell too long on any one standard. It's important to apply criteria that fits well and makes sense for each standard. Once you have agreed on the criteria for each standard, input the criteria on your CIA document. You can find drop-downs for real on the left side of your DOK column in the standards worksheet. This slide is strictly for example purposes in order to show you how your state standard sheet will appear when you have distinguished criteria for each standard. As of this date, these particular standards have not gone through the official prioritizing process. So never fear, grade 7 ELA teachers, I've only temporarily hijacked your document. Now note the first standard in this example, 7RL1. It's determined to be important for readiness and assessment. The next standard fits 3 criteria, but the third standard only fits the assessment criteria. Based on this example, the third standard will most likely be determined to be a second priority standard, even though it will be on the assessment. Remember, learning that endures through readiness, endurance, or leverage often trumps a one-and-done assessment item. To finish this example, the second standard will most likely be a first priority, and the first standard, well, it would be up for discussion. Once you've agreed on real criteria for each standard, you begin the sorting process. Although some standards will be readily identified as first priority, others will be identified through discussion, collaboration, and some old-fashioned detective work. Step 3. Begin to identify first priority standards, which are 30 to 50% of the total number of standards. These standards, meeting all 4 criteria, are definitely first priority. Review those that meet 3 or fewer criteria and decide which ones to add to the first priority list. Obviously, this is easier said than done, especially when you need to reach consensus as a team. In order to keep things moving, aim for at least 70% consensus, because it is doubtful that you will obtain 100% consensus for every standard. In order to help with step 3, which is to identify your first priority standards, you may have to put your detective hat on and be ready to look for clues. Those teams in grades 3 through 11 may have these AZ Merit resources available to them on the ADE assessment page. There's a link to this in our Google Classroom. Also, don't forget to reference your DOK levels and assessment blueprints. Make sure you're looking at the percentages of DOK level questions found on the assessment, and make sure that your first priority standards align to these percentages. Ainsworth provides an excellent tip for prioritizing. When considering whether to select one particular standard over another, discuss and decide which one is more comprehensive or rigorous, not the more foundational. In other words, if students could do the more challenging standard, then they will certainly be able to do the other one. The last step is perhaps the easiest of the real criteria process. Step 4. Those standards not identified as first priority are added to the second priority list. Many of these standards will support the more rigorous or comprehensive priorities. In other words, the leftovers become second priority standards, but unlike leftovers found in the back of your fridge, these leftover standards are not eliminated. They will still be taught because they support, connect to, or enhance the first priority standards. Congratulations! Once you prioritize your standards, you've completed the most challenging part of Phase 1. You're now ready to just transfer your work to the Assessment Year at a Glance document. More information on how to do this is found in the Google Classroom under Step 3 of Phase 1. Thank you so much for being part of this district-wide initiative of prioritizing our standards. It's our hope that the power of focus will empower you, our dedicated teachers, to provide a deeper, more focused level of instruction, which will in turn benefit all of our students with a greater mastery of each standard. This is Marcy Miller, Curriculum Coordinator for our district. If I can be of any help to you during your prioritizing process, please be sure to contact me. Your CIA office team is ready and willing to assist you in this work. Thank you for doing great things for our kids.